just as sort of a preamble, this whole topic of DeFi and privacy, I feel like came up multiple times, and I think it was mostly you who brought this up on the podcast, just like that was more challenging than a lot of people thought. And with this entire event and this panel, we hope to kind of scratch into what that actually means. Why is it challenging? What has potentially already been presented today that helps to solve that? And what do we think might still be off the table? Maybe we do very quick intros to each of you in case this is the only talk that people are catching. So Stani, do you want to start?
So short introduction, I'm Stani Kulechov. I'm the founder and CEO of the Aave protocol. And Aave protocol is practically a decentralized liquidity market governed by the Aave token holder community, where you can actually supply liquidity and pretty much earn interest rates on whatever you're supplying. And at the same time, you can actually use that supplied asset as a collateral, borrow other assets, or delegate that credit line for some other purpose to someone else. And team building smart contract-based applications for now for 4.5 years. Before that, did actually a lot of work on the legal industry and by education lawyer, and before that I did some fintech work. So practically built fintech applications related to finance. So very much about finance related stuff.
Nice. Zac, do you want to do a quick intro to yourself as well?
Sure thing. Hi, so I'm Zac, I'm the CTO of Aztec, and we focus on delivering transaction privacy to public blockchains, specifically Ethereum. So the ability to anonymize cryptocurrency holdings, and longer term, the ability to effectively program private smart contracts and have private interactions, both with at a peer-to-peer level, but also with DeFi protocols, and to do it all at scale is the end goal.
Cool. Tarun?
I'm Tarun. I'm a founder of a company called Gauntlet. We kind of assess the economic security in DeFi protocols, kind of testing sort of things that are outside of sort of just the types of things that you would get from an audit and formal verification. And previously I spent a bunch of time in high frequency trading, and then also in building ASICs, which is sort of how I ended up in this space. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about how the current designs are kind of very anti-privacy in some ways, more due to limitations. And so happy to be on this panel.
Mm-hmm. You're also a sometimes co-host of the ZK podcast.
Also sometimes co-host of ZKPodcast. Also invest in a lot of kind of projects like Stani. So
cool. So the first question I actually want to talk about is to get us all started on this idea of privacy and DeFi. What, do any popular DeFi applications, ones that are very well, very known and used, do they offer any sort of privacy today? And actually, I can throw this your way, Stani. Does Aave have privacy? And if not, why not? Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of DeFi is about bringing transparency in the sense, transparency to the markets. If you look at traditional finance, I mean, it's very difficult to quantify what is happening in this not just payment networks, but trading networks. And if you look at just centralized finance, you might see that how much cryptographic funds they have in balances commonly, but then you don't see that kind of trading activity, exposures, and so forth. DeFi is trying to kind of solve that as one of the byproducts, because it's a pseudo-anonymous ecosystem, and you have smart contracts, and you have to kind of see what the code is, what the transactions are. You bring that transparency. That is why DeFi products are like very good value proposition in our protocol, because you can quantify the risk that is in the protocol, and also like you can see like the interest rates they're built on chain, and and how they're governed. But that's the kind of thing. I think like the first step in DeFi has been like this transparency by default. But now that we are interacting more and more, like we don't have it. And that's why that's what's the issue, kind of like that we have been solving with DeFi in DeFi transparency. And now the privacy is kind of like the next step. There are some stuff built like on top. I've seen this kind of like one was like Blender, and another project called Hush Hush. And what they're actually doing is that you could withdraw and borrow from the protocol without revealing your identity in the similar way as Tornado Cash. And then one idea of retaining privacy is like use something like Tornado Cash, and you do it before you go into the DeFi and so forth. But I guess the problem is that when you start to accumulate wealth and value, not just like different tokens and so forth, but NFTs as well, then your identity starts to expose a bit. And when you actually change addresses and you start interacting with other addresses, the way you behave can be tracked and attributed, and that's going to be very difficult. So part of why I'm here is also kind of to learn more about like how these issues can be solved, and there's been like very interesting solutions.
Leads me to another question, which is like, what can analytics companies see? And I guess from what you've said, like everything, if they want to. Tarun?
Yeah. So like, I think you and I hosted a episode of the ZKPodcast where we interviewed Alex from Nansen, who kind of has probably the best tag data set in all of Ethereum, of basically millions of identities. So like, to give you a comparison, people who charge a lot more like Chainalysis and sell it to governments maybe have tens of thousands of ETH identities kind of mapped to individual users or funds or types of users. And so I think the interesting thing that we're seeing kind of right now is that the beauty of being able to build things composably comes at a cost. And that cost is sort of like composability increases the attack surface area. But if we get past that, the second thing is it comes at this cost of, you now instead of having like a single dollar bill that gets observed in a transaction moving between person A and person B, having the whole history of like every contract interaction means that you have a much richer sort of like graph database of people's interactions. And I think as Guillermo's talk showed, and that's like this paper we're working on to give a little generic framework for how you have to think about this stuff, is that DeFi has this problem of, for fair and transparent pricing or fair and transparent liquidations, you have to have a ton of public data. You have to be able to make it so that anyone who wants to participate can participate. But at the same time, if you want private data, you kind of need to make sure that you can't kind of reverse engineer the public data that's being given. And the current mechanisms, because they were built around the computational kind of like constraints of Ethereum, and also sort of the needs of traders who didn't care about privacy at the beginning, didn't really think through this type of stuff. And so at the end of the day, there has to be a better way of doing what we do in the normal world, which is split up public and private data. And hopefully things like Plonk and other improvements will actually get us to the point that it becomes easy for developers to do that without having to understand what's happening. I mean, as much as I love learning about class groups and kind of more esoteric things that I didn't think would ever be useful in real life from my undergrad degree, I also know that like 99.999% of app developers don't want to know what a circuit is. They don't want to know what a polynomial over kind of a semi-simple ring is. Like none of that, all of that stuff needs to be hidden from like app developers, and we're just like not there yet.
And there you go.
When you talk about that disconnect between kind of the app developers and the actual protocol folks who care very deeply about privacy, like, do you think that people care? That's actually the question. Is like, you sort of said like now it could be useful, it could be important to start incorporating or thinking about it, but like, do the actual users of the DeFi protocols care? Have you heard that, like, that ask? It's actually to all of you.
Yeah, to go on that one. Yes, obviously, I'm probably quite extremely biased, but I do think privacy is quite an essential component for Ethereum and public blockchains to really realize their full potential. Because the more transactions get put on chain, the more of your life you're putting on chain. So certainly when Ethereum, and Bitcoin were just starting out, and people were just playing, like it was just kind of a fun project. Then it was for all intents and purposes private. No one really knew what an address was, like how to link addresses and identities. But now, especially when people are putting a lot of value on chain, that's no longer the case. And I think if public blockchains and decentralized protocols are going to truly compete with kind of the existing private kind of Web2 financial infrastructure, you need privacy, because consumers expect it. People don't want their purchase history to be splashed all over the internet. They don't want to people to be able to look at how much they're being paid. Their salary is getting streamed through the Ethereum smart contract. I think it's going to become more and more relevant the more value it accumulates on chain.
As you say that, actually, it makes me realize that, like, currently a lot of ways that people still capture privacy or keep their privacy is to sort of interact with that Web2, to go back and forth. Even like folks who send tokens to an exchange in order to kind of like centralizingly mix it, even though it's not like actually private, there is some body that knows it. Most outside viewers won't be able to track it as well. And that interaction continues on that level of privacy. And I guess what you're saying here is, like, without those tools built into the Web3 stack, then you'll always kind of need that other part.
Yes, and it will always give Web2 a unique value proposition compared to Web3, which is that you can get, as long as you trust your centralized service provider, you can get very good, strong privacy. Whereas with current protocols on Ethereum, that's not currently the case.
Just add, when folks started adding privacy into DeFi, or even thinking about it, what were those first problems that people encountered? I don't know if Tarun, if you could say something, or maybe Zac, if you have an idea.
Yeah, I guess the first, I guess like the history of this all goes back to Zcash in 2015, when they, I think they were the first team to really convert these zero-knowledge proving systems like zkSnarks into something more than an academic toy, and actually turned it into a real product on a blockchain. And certainly, yes, it's been very much a process of having to reinvent the wheel, but to ensure everything is privacy preserving. Certainly, even basic things like how do you do value transfers? Like most or how do you just do the most basic thing that people take for granted these days. Things like I guess the main problems that have been solved / to be solved are how do you, well, maybe I can talk a bit more about, I guess, problems we're trying to solve, because there's the ones I've experienced with, which is how do you the main problem with zero-knowledge proving systems and privacy based around them is that the mathematical provers that you need to construct these proofs are extraordinarily slow. To the point where, like, if you have a regular computer program and you want to turn it into a zero-knowledge proof, running that prover will probably be slower than running the original program by about at least a factor of 1 million.
Mm-hmm.
And so that turns your quad core 2 gigahertz state of the art laptop into like the equivalent of a a home PC from 1980 with 4 kilobytes of RAM. And so to give a scale of the problem of actually trying to like do meaningful number crunching in these proving systems. And so that's where a lot of the focus and attention has been over the last few years, is on making these faster, finding new mathematical constructions that mean the amount of work you have to make one of these proofs is being reduced. And then on top of that, you also have, I think it's been hinted here, as the incredible user unfriendliness of programming zero-knowledge circuits. Right now, we're still in the stage where you really need to know what you're doing. You need to have quite like a relatively strong background in cryptography so that you're building something which is secure. Whilst like the quality of tooling has come on leaps and bounds lately, particularly things like CIRCOM and zkSync, it's still a very it's still an extremely primitive landscape compared to traditional programming languages. So I guess that's the next frontier that kind of needs to be conquered before we can start to get any kind of meaningful mass adoption amongst developers.
This actually makes me think of, I mean, one thing we maybe could do now, we could have maybe even done earlier in the session, which is somebody asked this throughout some of the talks, which is like, what exactly is DeFi and what is privacy in this case? Because DeFi, as you've just described it, if you talk about Zcash, DeFi is transactions of any kind, right? But when I think of DeFi, at least I tend to think of these like more sophisticated, like paradigms or something like that. And yeah, I wonder, do you make that distinction, or do you see DeFi?
Oh, I do. It's just that it's very hard to talk about private DeFi, like fully private DeFi, cryptographically private DeFi, because it doesn't really exist right now. Like you can anonymize your cryptocurrency as a public DeFi protocol, but in terms of like an actual using cryptography to enact a traditional DeFi protocol, traditional, I mean, it's only been around for a few years, but you know what I mean. I don't think somebody please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think anyone's done that yet.
Yeah, in fact, I would maybe go a little further to say that I've seen lots of dubious claims of achieving it that have very little basis in fact or reality, that they kind of provide both of those things. So I think we're kind of in the 2017 phase of private DeFi, where unfortunately there's a lot of hype and not many real proofs or things that actually work. But I think the simplest thing, to your point, your question of like, hey, I'm a centralized exchange user. Centralized exchange is a mixer for me. One thing that I think you can't really guarantee is that the kind of like the kind of products that you get from centralized entities are actually going to evolve as quickly as they do in DeFi. So for instance, like the kind of interest-bearing tokens, obviously Aave and Compound are kind of the first ones, but now there's like Yearn tokens and stuff like that. I don't think, and maybe this is a bit conjectural, but I do not think any centralized exchange provider would have ever offered you that. Why? Because they take a much larger portion of the VIG by offering you funding rate-based products, where they can kind of like capture both sides of that, and like you as the end user don't get as much yield. And you wouldn't actually have this innovation into the kind of like weird structured product development that you had in DeFi that was like almost orthogonal to what happened in CeFi until it grew big enough that they started copying it. And I think that type of like innovation cycle is extremely, extremely unlikely, in the centralized world, because centralized entities don't need to really offer you great structured products, because if they did, then they would be taking the other side of that and taking a very large fee. That's just like anyone who's ever kind of built these things or traded these things would tell you that like there's no kind of fairness in those products. Usually there's just a buyer who needs it really desperately for some reason, like a miner who has a ton of weird exposure. And the other side is like, a capital provider who doesn't have to really tell you how they're computing like their interest rate or, why they're charging you a certain amount. And I think the key thing about DeFi is it has this kind of transparent flexibility in the pricing mechanisms and the revelation mechanisms to all users. So all users sort of know how their pricing is computed. And they also have a very clear revelation mechanism of like how liquidations or kind of like slashing type events occur. And that kind of public observability of those types of events just doesn't happen in centralized exchanges. Servers got DDoSed. We liquidated your positions instead of going into the insurance fund, right? Like, how many times have you heard that in this industry? Probably a million, right, over the last 10 years. And so I think DeFi kind of goes a very different route by having like calculations and pricing and like public observability. But this is also why privacy is very hard. Like the reason it's kind of novel is because it provides this public transparent observability of exactly how things are computed. But on the other hand, like making that private would also somehow like reintroduce some of the problems that you have with the centralized vendors. So kind of figuring out how to partition the space of what the public portion and the private portion is, I think that's the problem to solve before you can actually get the like, you know, the app developers and the ZK people kind of in the same plane, if that makes sense. At least
isn't that actually like one of the promises of ZK though? Like exactly what you described, the provability. I mean, I've heard that example. Emre, who spoke earlier from Mina, that's one of their examples that they highlight often is like provability of underlying code using zero knowledge proofs, knowing that like it was implemented correctly or there is something in it that is correct. I know it's maybe a bit far off still, but that was, I know, one proposal.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess there's still this fact of the matter that the mechanism by which people are trading or ensuring that like a system is economically stable needs to kind of commute in a mathematical sense with the ZK operations. And right now that doesn't really happen because like a lot of the economic safety guarantees of DeFi protocols rely on public revelation mechanisms. So I could make a ZK proof that proves to you that I computed the correct interest rate without leaking the interest rate. But then I notice that there's a transaction that's large and that changed the interest rate. And so I know I can kind of try to impute statistically like side channel type of thing. So like until you actually have like a mempool also and like a transaction processing model that hides timing data, I actually think it's a little bit, we're still not quite there yet, which is why this gets back to the question of how do you partition what you want public and not? And that's actually still, I think, the thing that's necessary to make the economic mechanisms kind of have zero commutator with the ZK type of things.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I think it's having provable computations is slightly different from having like data privacy. Certainly using zkSNUCs to kind of reduce the computational burden on blockchains is extremely valuable and something which I think we're going to see a lot more of in the future. Because you can have a very complicated DeFi protocol with very difficult and expensive calculations to perform, like which isn't feasible on Ethereum today because it would cost like say $1 million gas in the smart contract. Instead of that, you could just send a zero knowledge proof to the blockchain, going, yeah, look, here's the interest rate, here are all the metrics, and I proved I calculated them correctly. But as Tarun said, it's for pretty much every DeFi protocol to work, you need quite a lot of public information to make those computations. And if you add privacy, then that information goes away, so it doesn't work. Although I do think the solution that this is just my punt on how the future is going to look is that the way that we're going to achieve privacy in DeFi protocols is by the separation between public and private state. In my opinion, will be identities of users will be hidden, and if you want private transactions, you need uniformity of transactions. So if every transaction looks the same, and you don't know anything about the identity of the user, then you have very strong privacy, but you can still perform the calculations you need to run a DeFi protocol because you have all the basic, the transaction volumes. You'll know, how what's being put into and out of put into and taken out of the protocol. In my opinion, that's probably how things are going to look if we're going to achieve private DeFi in the midterm.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other kind of building blocks, and I think you kind of touched on that there, is this idea of like, I mean, could you make private oracles? Like, aren't oracles kind of like trusted because they're not private? Like, you have to be able to somehow trace that, or would that also give away things if you have a public oracle but a private system? Like, does it? Yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts on?
So one thing I will say is, again, a lot of this boils down to like separating the time dimension from when privacy is realized. So like the time dimension of the transaction being processed and propagated through the system versus like, hey, there's a proof that it was computed correct and what time that arrives. Because the timing differences actually leak a lot of information. And so you with an oracle, you kind of want something where you can do a ZK proof that the correct answer went into the calculation. Like, oracle update comes in, imagine it's almost a homomorphic encryption type of thing, so stronger than ZK proof. So I take in the oracle update encrypted, I'm able to operate on the oracle update, compute whether Aave positions are liquidatable, and then after a certain number of blocks, publish the public oracle update and the proof and kind of show that, hey, the calculation of the liquidatability was done a block ago or 2 blocks ago and is correct, and here's the data we use, you can verify. So you have to make sure these timing things are actually hidden, because that's not a trivial thing either. That's like where most of the side channel attacks for these such things come from.
There was a few questions. Oh, go ahead, Aave.
Yeah, I definitely like. I was just stuck on thinking on the point that Tarun mentioned, like where kind of like you draw the different lines of what part of like DeFi or let's say data should be public and what should be private, and even more like who decides that. Because the way we have now DeFi, what makes it very interesting is that I could just go into these protocols and actually I could see like what's the liquidity there, what's the level of risk, and quantify whether actually I should be depositing there. Is the risk worth the reward? And that's like kind of like a interesting part of the whole DeFi. And then if you think about it, like to what extent you should have the privacy and who decides that? That's like that's a very difficult part of it. I guess like you could always go the road that you let the governance decide and so forth. You know, where you should add those kind of like a privacy features. But it's not that easy yet. But I definitely would like to see more initiatives in decentralized finance that, you know, we try to add some privacy in certain functions. And I'm kind of like, I'm even like somehow surprised that there isn't that many, you know, tornado cash like things going on that's applied. But also like I think what's the issue is that you don't need to solve things on application level necessarily. You know, if you can have some sort of privacy with let's say a mixer, and you can operate like globally in DeFi with the just practically going through a mixer. It's kind of clunky solution at the moment, but still, then you don't need to like build privacy specifically on various of protocols, and that could be one thing. But it's still like very, very interesting to see like how things will evolve.
There was a question actually in the chat here, which is directed to Aztec and Zac, and that is, would Aztec layer sort of the zk rollup, would that support interest-bearing tokens, or does it currently only support direct transactions?
So currently it only supports transactions. To be honest, it only supports right now Ethereum and DAI, but that's mostly for legal reasons, which we're getting legal advice on whether on the tokens that we can support. As for supporting interest-bearing tokens in the future, absolutely. It's quite hard to do because generally you want to, if you were in a private setting, you want to do things like obscure the age of a transaction, and you kind of need that to calculate interest rate. The way that we're going to do it in the short term is effectively you have a public interest, a collection of interest-bearing tokens that everyone can see, but that position is owned by a large number of people, and you don't know the relative holdings, and you don't know the identity, and you don't know the identities of the people holding it either.
Interesting. So you see the pool, see the participants.
Yeah. Exactly. So like the idea is, imagine you want to swap some Ethereum for like interest-bearing token like Aave. So the idea is you deposit Ethereum into our rollup, and then you would aggregate, say, 100 transactions of these deposit transactions, like 100 of these DeFi transactions together inside the rollup. So observers can kind of see this pool of Ethereum being filled, but they don't know who's filling it. And then once that pool is filled with, let's say, 100 individuals, you then send that transaction through to Aave, the Aave network, and then get a big block of Aave tokens back in return. And then a smart contract holds that as a custodian for the rollup. And so, no one knows who holds positions in it. You're muted, sorry.
Timing delay of sorts? Would you wait for that to fill up, for that process to start, or would it be like whoever's there at a certain time?
You'd have to wait for it to fill up. So this is a process which will become much. The user experience will improve significantly with greater liquidity and use. But yeah, at the moment, the way we constructed it, you'd have to wait for it to fill up.
Okay.
Yeah, one thing I think that happens in the normal world that I think people in DeFi don't take advantage of it, and partially because of Ethereum kind of issues, but also partially just like this might be expensive to do, is that like when you do a secondary offering for like a large set of fixed rate instruments, you usually kind of provide some type of like priority interest weighting, or like a swap where basically people only settle the swap at the end of like an auction closing, and the earliest participants in the swap kind of get like a slight booster. And so like there's a lot of economic designs you can do to try to like incentivize filling these types of pools that, I think if you draw from traditional finance, you could actually make it seem close enough to the end user who kind of doesn't really care that much about 1 second interest rates, but they really care about like 2-hour interest rates or something.
Cool. Yeah. Tarun, there was actually a question directed towards you as well about kind of going back to those earlier points we were talking about from Francois. Should developers embrace a mission of educating the public on the consequences of the lack of privacy in the financial world?
I think like in some utopian ideal world, sure. And from a more practical standpoint, I don't think developers end up being the people who communicate messages to the masses writ large. I do think maybe they kind of should figure out how to communicate it, but I think it's going to take more than just kind of developers communicating the role of privacy. It's going to take like many different people in these systems kind of involved. Yeah, so I think that's kind of that's it. I think like at the end of the day, the Robinhood stuff kind of shows people what happens when you don't have privacy in these financial systems pretty starkly, right? Like people didn't even realize it. And I think to Francois' second part of this question, I would just point them to that and just be like, look, you have a live example of what happens when everything.
But do you think if more privacy was already built into this, would that also encourage people from traditional finance to actually a barrier to them entering the space now, or they don't care, or they don't know?
I think it's a barrier, but Stani probably knows the best because he's talking to people trying to use Aave who are big capital providers. But I'll say like at least from the more like HFT hedge fund side, I think one of the reasons kind of the traditional players have lagged behind kind of native players like Alameda type of people It's because they're too afraid of this privacy thing. It's 100% like, you know, you go talk to some people, they'll definitely be like, like everyone can just see my holdings.
Yeah.
And like it's like an old money versus new money thing. And by new money,
Yeah,
I mean like last 3 years.
I agree. I agree, Tarun. Like that's the especially on the institutional side, like that's a concrete issue. You know, once you kind of go all the risk involved, let's say like whatever there is the risk of deposits, the underlying, let's say, stable coins, and then like the kind of like the last bastion is the privacy there, and that's like that's a bit challenge. Like I think like the native more institutionalized crypto market participants, for them, of course, it's not that of a big of deal. But when you're explaining to a new audience, that becomes a bit of a challenging. But one thing is interesting is that you know we have a lot of like bespoke things here. Like the whole DeFi is kind of like bespoke. You know, the transparency and everything like that can be explained. But you know, there's definitely like a big issue if you know if and it's not just actually like the for this market participant, it's not actually the just the fact that you know you will see like how they transact just for the sake of transactions, you know, and the amounts and so forth. But actually, like there will be like the native participants who will see, okay, they're transacting this way, so let me just grab whatever they're trying to do and front run that market participant. And being in this kind of like an ecosystem for them is kind of like a bit of challenging. And it's I think that the front running is a bigger issue, like kind of in a commercial environment.
I actually this reminds me a little bit about how like early on in social media, where it's like younger people sharing all their information and older people being like, "What are you doing? That's terrible. Don't do that." They didn't care, and now the adults have joined Facebook and everything sucks. But anyway, just a thought. I want to follow up with a question that Andre asked here. In a private DeFi setting, shouldn't it be possible to reverse the paradigm? I think he's referring to what you spoke about, Zac, where you keep everything private by default and then periodically publish important information like liquidity or interest rates without tying it to individual transactions.
Yeah, that's the goal. It's quite hard to do though, because for example, if you want to keep everything completely private, but say every week publish an interest rate, how do you compute that interest rate? Because if everybody's positions and holdings are private and encrypted, they need to share that information with somebody that can then aggregate that data to compute an interest rate, which obviously leaks a lot of information. It's not very decentralized at that point because you have to kind of trust someone with your data to aggregate it together. So that's why it's quite hard to keep everything private by default, but then like conditionally release aggregated information. There are ways around that using multi-party computations. Another approach is just being very kind of just defining very clearly what information every transaction kind of keeps some information private and some public. Is at least is an easier way of doing things. Like if you keep every identity private and you make sure that every transaction is relatively uniform, like within your anonymity set. So like every transaction is like say 100 DAI. If you're doing some DAI transactions, where if you want to send more than 100 DAI, you just send you send multiple transactions, but they all look like they're coming from anonymous identities, so nobody can link them. It's a little bit clunky, but it's so far I think it's like the only way I know of that's practical without getting into some really advanced cryptographic like multi-party MPC protocols that aren't would be very hard to implement on Ethereum.
Yeah, and I would add one thing, which is there's kind of some like in my head I conceptualize it as kind of like a kind of lower bound type of thing, like a Heisenberg type of thing, where kind of there's also a risk versus privacy trade-off. So the more private your transactions, the harder it is to actually do kind of large scale liquidations. So under like something that happened this morning, right, where Kraken had this flash crash where Ethereum went down 60%, there's a ton of liquidations caused by that. The problem is if you're forcing people to actually have to spread out their transactions over time and in smaller chunks, you actually increase the chance that the system doesn't actually stay solvent. And so there's a very fine line you have to walk here about how much you keep private and how much you don't keep private, because the overall risk that the smart contract holds at any given time, at least for leverage systems.
Yeah, completely. There's a trade-off because like with at the very least, if you want privacy, you're going to have to pay with latency to like aggregate transactions together or wait a certain time, the amount of time so people can't link a deposit and withdraw. And that doesn't that for specific for leverage systems or trading environments where things are as high frequency, you can't wait 10 seconds for a transaction to settle. That is a problem.
Follow up to that. Andre was asking, do you want to mention some of the names of those vaporware privacy platforms?
I'll just say, do your own research, but anyone who's saying they're offering private Uniswap balancer curve very likely isn't, as Guillermo's talk has illustrated. So, and there'll be a paper kind of doing that type of stuff. So anyway, just
but maybe we'll still be nice, not call out anybody here. I want to say, first of all, so there's one last question from Raul, which is the best resources to learn about various ZKP algorithms. But that, I would say, probably wouldn't necessarily need to be here. I mean, this is get into the podcast, follow the newsletter. We definitely have lots of resources to help you out there. Zac, I feel like Aztec probably has a platform full of zero knowledge proof documentation, or maybe some places to send folks.
I must confess that one of the problems with the space is basically everybody who's involved in zero knowledge proofs at this level is very busy kind of building technology out and is not spending a lot of time writing documentation and books, unfortunately. I mean, it depends on how in depth you want to go. Like obviously, like the zero knowledge podcast. Absolutely, it's the best, in my opinion. It's the best introduction. If you want to do a deep dive, I mean, Dan Bernier just recently, he's a cryptographer, I believe, at Stanford. He's recently published a very comprehensive kind of guide, introduction to zero knowledge proofs in general. I believe you can find it online. I think it's just a PDF he's released for free. It's extremely good text. It's quite hard to get into, and it doesn't cover ZK snarks yet because they're a bit too modern. But it certainly is a great theoretical background into zero knowledge proofs.
Yeah, and as Alan mentioned, there is a ZKP online course in the works, but that's not out yet. And it's still a little TBD because it got very delayed by last year's kerfuffle. But there is something that is in the works. But in general, I would say get involved in the community. You can also ask in the Telegram chat. I know there are platforms and repos where they've just added some documents. So that's some ideas. And actually, I think that's a really nice point, though, to wrap up our day. I want to say a big. Unless you had something you wanted to.
I want to give one person a shout out who I saw in the audience, which is Ariel, who wrote some blogs on the Zcash website in 2016 or 15, which eventually led to me quitting my job. So thanks for writing those.
Very cool.
Sorry, Ariel, I should have given you a shout out. I'm sorry. Yes.
Those are really good blog posts for the basic ZK. You want to, if you know enough math, but you're I don't want to read this code. It's too complicated, but you kind of want a high level, really good, pedantic but not in the weeds introduction. I think that it's one of the best things I've read as first. I know nothing about zero knowledge proofs other than Bitcoin maximalists calling everything moon math without knowing why.
Yeah, James asked if that was Ariel Gabizon. Yes, they were talking about Ariel, who is Zac's colleague at Aztec. Cool. I don't know if you wanted to say something, Zac, but I'm going to keep going. Okay, so yeah, the next thing we're going to do, if you're into it, we actually are going to head over to gather.town and hang out a little bit. If you're still interested in maybe catching up with any of the folks here, I know I'm encouraging Zac and Stani and Tarun to head over there as well. So maybe you can keep that conversation going for a little while. I think we have the room for about like an hour or so. And it should be fine for everyone to come. If there's any issues, let me know. It's actually the same as the ZK Summit. It's the same room. I just kind of repurposed it. There's different banners with zkSessions now. The password and link, John just put into the chat here. And you also should have received an email like about 20 minutes ago with those details as well. So I hope to see you there. I'm actually going to sign off. I will be getting these videos out to you over the next little while. I have a plan for Guillermo's. And yeah, thanks everyone for this, coming to the first zkSessions and bearing with us through all of this. But I do think like these challenges tend to make the crew a little tighter. So I'm really glad you all came along. Cool. See you later then.